The stars sparkled in the deep black sky as Captain Jake Lawson piloted his small, sleek exploration ship through the uncharted space. He'd been out here for days, studying distant planets and cataloging strange new systems. It was a quiet job, one that didn't require much excitement. But that was the way Jake liked it. He wasn't searching for trouble. He preferred the calm of space, away from the noise of the crowded Earth. Today, however, as his ship drifted toward a barren planet, something strange appeared on his radar. A blip, a small object. At first, he assumed it was a minor glitch or space debris. But as he zoomed in, his eyes widened in disbelief. A spaceship, wrecked and smoking, lay half-buried in the sandy surface below. The ship was unlike any Jake had ever seen before, alien, yet sophisticated, with glowing panels that flickered faintly against the dark landscape. His heart raced as he made a quick decision. He needed to investigate. He landed his ship several kilometers from the crash site, the ship's engines humming low as the ground beneath shook. The planet was cold, dry, and eerily silent. There were no signs of life, no animals, no plants, only dust and rocks. Jake grabbed his toolkit and stepped outside, his boots crunching against the sand. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, but the only sound was the soft whistle of the wind. As he neared the wreckage, he saw the glowing panels of the ship flicker weakly. The craft was heavily damaged, parts of it torn open, as if it had been struck by some powerful force. The metal was twisted, and black smoke still seeped from the damaged engines. But there was something else, something more pressing. A soft moan, barely audible, coming from inside the ship. Jake hesitated, his hand resting on the handle of his weapon. His mind raced. What if it was a trap? What if this was some kind of ambush? But then, his curiosity won. He couldn't leave whatever was inside to suffer alone, especially if there was a chance of helping. He carefully approached the ship's open hatch, his eyes scanning the wreckage for movement. A low groan echoed again, followed by the soft, labored breathing of someone, or something, still alive. He stepped into the ship, his flashlight cutting through the dim atmosphere. There, in the corner of the ship, was the source of the noise. A woman, or at least what appeared to be a woman. She was lying on the cold metal floor, her alien features sharp and delicate. Her skin shimmered in pale shades of blue and silver, and her hair, long and flowing, was the color of starlight. Blood, or something similar, stained the floor around her, evidence of her injuries. Jake moved quickly, kneeling beside her. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyes were closed, her face pale from pain, but there was a strength about her. Despite the circumstances, her presence seemed regal, even in such a vulnerable state. "Hey," Jake whispered, gently shaking her arm. "Can you hear me?" The alien woman's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they locked with his. They were bright, silver eyes, filled with a strange mix of fear and relief. Her voice was weak when she spoke, but there was a certain authority in her tone. "You are human," she said, her words almost a whisper, as if speaking drained her. Jake nodded, his heart racing. "Yeah, I'm Captain Jake Lawson. You're safe now. I'll help you." She winced slightly but managed to smile faintly. "I never expected to find another human out here." Jake's concern grew. He needed to act fast if she was going to survive. "You've been through a lot," he said, quickly scanning her injuries. Her shoulder was badly wounded, and there was a deep cut along her leg. He had basic first aid skills, but nothing that could fix serious alien injuries. He needed to get her back to his ship. "Hold on," Jake said, lifting her gently in his arms. "I'll get you to my ship. You'll be all right." As he carried her out of the wreckage, he couldn't help but wonder who, or what, she was. What kind of ship had she been on? And why was she out here alone? Her people, if she had any, had left her behind. Her eyes fluttered closed again, her body relaxing in his arms. Jake looked down at her, his mind racing with questions. She was an alien, clearly, but she was in pain, and she needed help. Nothing else mattered now. He hurried back to his ship, the mystery of this strange woman and her dangerous journey just beginning to unfold. Jake carefully placed the injured alien woman on the medical bed in his ship. The sterile, quiet environment was a sharp contrast to the chaos of the crash site. He moved quickly, checking the various instruments and tools at his disposal. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a deep sense of responsibility. This woman, or whatever she was not just some stranded traveler. She was someone who had clearly been through a lot. He stepped back, eyes scanning her injuries once again. The gash on her leg was deep, and her shoulder was clearly dislocated. He could treat the bleeding and stabilize her, but beyond that, he was uncertain what else he could do. Her wounds seemed alien, different from anything he had ever seen. But the human part of him knew one thing: he couldn't leave her to suffer. He had to try. Jake worked quickly, using his first aid supplies to clean the wounds. The woman didn't stir much, her body too weak to protest. He was careful, but as he moved, she groaned softly, her eyes opening for a brief moment. They met his gaze again, silver eyes filled with confusion and curiosity. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice faint but steady. "I'm Captain Jake Lawson. Just a regular guy trying to do his job," he said with a half-smile. His voice was calm, but inside, he was nervous. He had no idea what he was getting into. "You're safe now. I found you after your ship crashed. You were unconscious." She blinked slowly, taking in his words, but seemed to struggle with forming a response. Her breathing remained slow and shallow, but there was a hint of recognition in her expression. It was like she understood what he was saying, but something in her mind was still foggy, as if part of her was lost. "My name is Lyra," she whispered, barely audible. I thought I was alone." Jake's heart sank. Alone. The word echoed in his mind. She hadn't just crashed, she had been abandoned. Left behind by the people she once knew. He didn't say anything, choosing instead to focus on her injuries. He worked silently, trying his best to apply a pressure bandage to the gash on her leg and straighten her dislocated shoulder. As he worked, Lyra's eyes drifted closed, the pain and exhaustion taking over her body once more. Jake couldn't help but feel a deep sense of empathy for her. She wasn't just some alien stranger. She was someone in desperate need of help. And for now, he was the only one who could give it. Hours passed, and Jake found himself checking the ship's systems and monitoring Lyra's condition. He had no idea what to do next. He wasn't a doctor, and this was far beyond anything he'd ever experienced before. He was far from any known civilization, out in deep space where few ships ever ventured. What if her people had enemies? What if he was making a huge mistake? But despite the worry gnawing at him, he couldn't abandon her. She was hurt and alone in the vastness of space. He had to do something. When Lyra's eyes fluttered open again, it was clear that she was more aware of her surroundings. Her eyes no longer appeared hazy or confused. There was still a trace of exhaustion, but she was conscious now, fully aware that she wasn't alone anymore. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jake looked down at her, startled by the sincerity in her words. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what anyone would do." Lyra's eyes seemed to soften, and for the first time since waking up, a small smile appeared on her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell Jake that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely lost. Maybe there was hope for her after all. "I'm not sure what happened," Lyra said, her voice steadier now. "One minute, I was with my people, and the next, everything fell apart." Jake listened closely, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand. "What do you mean, your people?" She nodded, wincing slightly as she shifted in the bed. Was part of an advanced civilization. We had colonies across the stars. But something happened. We were betrayed, left behind." Jake's mind raced. Betrayed. Left behind. It didn't make sense. But the more she spoke, the more he began to understand. She wasn't just some wanderer or traveler. She was from a fallen empire, someone who had known a powerful past, but was not alone, scattered in the wake of destruction. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. "It must have been hard." Lyra's expression hardened for a moment, the weight of her past evident in her eyes. But then she let out a long breath, as if releasing the burden for a moment. It was. But now, I don't know where to go. I have nothing left. Jake felt a pang of sympathy for her. He didn't know how much longer he could keep her here, or what he could do to help her. But one thing was certain. She wasn't just some random alien he found. She had a past, a history, and a future that was yet to be written. And somehow, it seemed like that future was tied to him now. "Well," Jake said, offering a reassuring smile, "you're not alone anymore. I'll help you." Her eyes softened, and for the first time since their meeting, Lyra looked at him not with suspicion, but with gratitude. "Thank you, Captain Lawson. I don't know what I would do without you." Jake just nodded. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. This was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The days passed slowly aboard Jake's small ship, each one blending into the next. Lyra had started to recover, though her body was still weak from the crash. Jake kept her comfortable, providing what medical assistance he could, but there was only so much he could do. They were in the middle of nowhere, far from any civilization, far from any help. The isolation felt heavy, but Jake didn't mind. He had lived alone in space before, and it was always quiet, peaceful. But now, it felt different. The presence of Lyra brought a strange energy to the ship, an energy that made the silence feel less comforting and more uncertain. Lyra spent most of her time in the medical bay, resting, though her mind was clearly occupied with thoughts of her past. Occasionally, she would sit up and gaze out the ship's window, staring at the endless stars as though they held the answers to the questions she couldn't ask. Jake would often find himself watching her from a distance. She seemed so far away, her mind trapped somewhere in the past. He could tell that she was struggling, trying to piece together the fragments of her lost world. The weight of it all was visible in her eyes. One evening, as the ship drifted past a distant moon, Lyra asked Jake a question that caught him off guard. "Do you know what it feels like to lose everything?" Her voice was quiet, her tone soft, but full of sadness. Jake paused for a moment, unsure how to answer. He had his own struggles, his own losses, but none like what Lyra had gone through. "I can't say I do," he replied honestly. "But I think it's something you never truly get over." Lyra nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the table before her. "I had a family once, a home. I was part of something greater than myself. Now I'm just lost." Jake felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a person with a life, with a past, and that past had been taken from her in a way he couldn't even begin to understand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice sincere. "I wish there was more I could do." Lyra looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting the soft glow of the ship's lights. "You've already done more than I ever expected," she said quietly. "You found me. You saved me." Jake shook his head, trying to downplay his role. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." There was a brief silence, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like two people sharing an understanding without needing to say much. But then, Lyra spoke again, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know where to go. I don't even know if there's anything left to go back to." Jake glanced at the navigation console, deep in thought. "We could try looking for your people," he suggested. "There's a chance someone is out there. A ship, a colony, something." Lyra didn't answer right away, and Jake could tell she was conflicted. She had been betrayed by her people, left behind, abandoned. How could she go back to them after everything that had happened? But after a long moment of contemplation, she nodded. Maybe you're right. I don't know if I'll ever find them, but I can't just give up. Not yet. Jake smiled, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in days. He had no idea what they would find out there. He wasn't a hero, just a man who had happened to stumble upon something that could change both their lives. But if Lara could keep going, if she could find the strength to press on, then maybe, just maybe, he could help her find what she was searching for. The next morning, Jake set the ship's course to the nearest star system that might hold some answers. It was a long shot. In deep space, there were thousands of stars, billions of planets, but who knew which one might have the answers they needed? It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. As the ship hummed along, Lara sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead. There was something almost peaceful about the way she stared into the distance, her mind lost in thoughts he could only imagine. She had lost everything, her family, her home, her civilization. But she wasn't giving up. There was still a flicker of hope in her eyes, a determination that Jake found inspiring. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Lara was no longer alone, and he wouldn't let her be again. Jake's ship moved quietly through the vast emptiness of space, its engines humming steadily as the stars streaked past. The long journey ahead was uncertain, but both Jake and Lara had their reasons to keep going. For Jake, it was the responsibility he felt to help her, no matter the cost. For Lara, it was the chance to find answers, to reconnect with the past she had lost. The journey wasn't an easy one. The ship was small, and the two of them were now living in close quarters. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with the weight of the unknown. Lara spent most of her time in the observation deck, staring out at the endless stretch of stars, as though trying to spot some sign of what had happened to her people. Jake, on the other hand, focused on maintaining the ship, checking systems, and doing his best to chart a course to the nearest star systems that might hold the answers. Days turned into weeks, but neither of them gave up hope. They knew there had to be something out there, some sign of Lara's lost civilization. Jake had access to all sorts of databases, but nothing he found seemed to match what Lara had described. Her people were advanced, their technology far beyond anything Jake had seen, and yet they had vanished, leaving no trace behind. One evening, as Jake sat in the cockpit, going over star maps, Lara approached him. She had been quiet for most of the day, and Jake could tell that something was weighing heavily on her mind. "Jake," she began softly, "do you think we'll find them? My people?" Jake looked over at her, his face thoughtful. The question had been on his mind too, but he hadn't wanted to say it aloud. He didn't want to give her false hope. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll keep looking. We'll keep looking." Lara nodded, her eyes distant. "I don't know what I'll do if we don't find them. Everything I had is gone. I can't just be lost forever." Jake could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the fear that had crept in since they'd started their journey. It was the same fear that he felt deep down, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. They were out here in the vastness of space, alone, chasing a dream of finding something that might not even exist anymore. "You won't be lost," Jake said firmly, turning in his seat to look at her. "You're not alone. And you're not giving up. We'll find something." There was a long pause as Lara looked at him, studying his expression. Finally, she gave a small smile, one that was hesitant but genuine. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than before. The silence between them lingered for a moment, but it wasn't as heavy as before. They were a team now, two individuals thrown together by fate, both determined to find answers. The next few days were spent traveling through systems that Jake had pinpointed on his star charts. Some were promising, with planets that had once been home to thriving civilizations, but when they arrived, they found nothing. Empty cities, abandoned structures, and eerie silence. It was as though the entire population had simply disappeared without a trace. Each failure weighed heavily on Lyra. She had hoped that each new planet they visited would offer some clue, some glimmer of hope. But with every empty world, the reality of her situation began to sink in deeper. Jake could see it in her eyes, the way she became more withdrawn, more resigned with each passing day. One evening, as the ship entered another system, Jake set the course for a small moon that had shown signs of past habitation. "This one looks different," he said, trying to sound optimistic. Lyra, who had been sitting in the observation deck, didn't respond immediately. She stood up slowly and walked toward the cockpit, her steps heavy. "What if it's just like the others?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with doubt. "What if I'm the only one left?" Jake turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You don't know that. There's still a chance, and we're not stopping until we find it." Lyra took a deep breath and nodded, though her eyes still held the weight of doubt. She sat in the seat next to Jake, looking out at the approaching moon. The surface of the moon was dotted with craters and ancient structures that looked long abandoned. But there was something about it, something that made Lyra's heart race. As they descended toward the surface, Jake spoke again. "Even if we don't find your people here, I think we'll find something important. Maybe something that can lead us to the next place. We'll keep going, no matter what." Lyra didn't answer at first, but as the ship touched down on the dusty surface, she finally turned to him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Jake smiled at her, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "You're not just some mission, Lyra. You matter. You've got a future, and I'm going to help you find it." With those words, they prepared to leave the ship and explore the ruins of the moon. Lyra's heart was heavy, but she knew Jake was right. She couldn't give up. She wasn't the last of her kind. She wasn't alone anymore. Not as long as Jake was by her side. As they stepped out into the cool, desolate landscape, Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. And as long as they were together, she knew they would find the answers she needed. The air on the moon's surface was thin, and the sky was a pale gray, streaked with wisps of clouds. Lyra and Jake stepped off the ship, the sound of their boots crunching against the dusty ground breaking the silence. The landscape before them was vast and empty, with towering craters and jagged rock formations. It looked like any other lifeless world, yet something about it felt different, something that made Lyra's heart race with anticipation. The ruins of ancient structures dotted the surface, their once grand designs now reduced to rubble. The architecture was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Tall spires, wide arches, and intricate carvings that hinted at a culture far more advanced than anything he had known. Lyra's eyes scanned the scene, a mixture of curiosity and pain reflected in her gaze. This was her people's past, yet it felt so distant, so far removed from who she was now. "Do you think they lived here?" Jake asked, trying to break the heavy silence as he examined the structures. "I don't know," Lyra replied quietly, her voice distant. "But it's possible. It could have been a colony, or a place of significance to my people." They began to walk through the ruins, careful not to disturb the fragile remains of what once had been. Every step felt like walking through history, a history Lyra had been cut off from, a history she no longer remembered fully. The deeper they ventured into the ancient site, the more Lyra felt a strange pull. Her instincts, the ones she had trusted all her life, seemed to be guiding her toward something. She didn't know what it was, but it felt important. Something deep inside her told her that this place held the answers she sought. "I feel like I've been here before," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not like any memory I can remember clearly. It's like a dream." Jake looked at her, concerned. He had seen the way her face had grown pale as they explored the ruins, her steps becoming more hesitant. "What's going on?" he asked gently. "Do you think this is triggering something?" Lyra shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I can't explain it. It's like there's a part of me that recognizes this place, but I can't reach it, like it's buried too deep. They continued walking, passing through an archway that led into a larger chamber. The room was dark, with only the faintest light from the outside filtering through cracks in the walls. In the center of the room was a massive stone structure, covered in ancient symbols and markings that Lyra couldn't decipher. But there was something else, something that caught her eye. At the base of the stone, hidden beneath layers of dust, was a small glowing object. It seemed out of place, like a beacon in the dark. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, she moved toward it. "What is that?" Jake asked, stepping closer to her as she reached for the object. I don't know," Lyra replied, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the object. The moment her fingers made contact, the soft glow brightened, and the ground beneath them seemed to hum with energy. Jake stepped back, eyes wide, as the air around them began to crackle. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tinged with alarm. Lyra could feel it, an energy surging through her, like a forgotten memory beginning to surface. The object in her hand was warm now, and the symbols on the stone began to glow with an eerie light, lighting up the room around them. Suddenly, Lyra's vision blurred. The world around her spun as if she were being pulled through time itself. Flashbacks began to flood her mind. Images of her people, their grand cities, their advanced technology. She saw faces, some familiar, some not, smiling, working together, building a future. She saw flashes of her own life, but it was all incomplete, fragmented. And then she saw it, the memory that had been hidden away, the moment of betrayal. Lyra gasped, her hand pulling away from the object as if it had burned her. The vision stopped, leaving her breathless and trembling. The object fell from her hand, landing softly on the ground. Jake rushed to her side. "Lyra, are you okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were wide with shock. She could feel the weight of the memory in her chest, the realization of what had happened. The betrayal. Her people had been destroyed, not by some external enemy, but by their own kind. A faction within her own civilization had turned on them, choosing power over peace. The pain of that knowledge hit her like a wave. "I remember now," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It wasn't an accident. My people, they didn't just disappear. They were betrayed." Jake stood still, absorbing the gravity of her words. He could see the tears welling in her eyes, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had always known Lyra was more than just a survivor. She was someone who had lived through something unimaginable. Now, the full weight of her past was beginning to emerge. "That's why you're the last one," Jake said quietly, his heart heavy for her. "Because your people were destroyed from within." Lyra nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to think there was still hope, that maybe someone else survived. But now, I know the truth." Jake reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "You're not alone. Not anymore. We'll find a way to make this right." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and a new determination. The truth was painful, but it was also a new beginning. She had lost everything, but she hadn't lost herself. And with Jake by her side, she would keep fighting, no matter the odds. As they left the chamber, the glowing object still pulsing softly behind them, Lyra knew one thing for certain. Her past was dark, but her future was still unwritten. Lyra and Jake stood together at the edge of the ruined city, staring at the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the broken landscape. The ruins stretched for miles, each stone and twisted metal telling a story of what had been. It felt as if the entire planet had been abandoned, as if the echoes of war still lingered in the air. Jake turned to Lyra, his expression a mix of concern and determination. He could see the weight of her memories pressing down on her, but he also saw something else, an undeniable strength that had always been there, even in the darkest moments. "We need to keep moving," Jake said quietly. "Whatever you saw back there, we can't let it stop us now. We're getting closer." Liara nodded, her hand gripping the strap of her bag tightly. She had learned the painful truth about her people's destruction, but that only fueled her determination to find what remained. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find. Answers, a cure, or perhaps a way to rebuild. All she knew was that the past wasn't done with her yet. "We're not done," she whispered, more to herself than to Jake. "I will not let them have died for nothing." They continued walking through the ruins, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of metal or the rustle of wind against the broken walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Liara pressed on. There was something out there, something that could change everything. She had to find it. As they made their way through a narrow alley, Jake suddenly stopped. His hand shot out, grabbing Liara's arm and pulling her to a halt. She looked up at him, startled, but he was already scanning the area ahead of them. "What is it?" Liara asked, her heart racing. "I think we're not alone," Jake said in a low voice, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkened ruins. "I heard something." Liara felt her heart skip a beat. Her senses were on high alert now, her ears straining to hear any sounds. For a moment, all she could hear was the wind, but then it came again, a faint rustling, as if someone, or something, was moving through the shadows. "Stay close," Jake instructed, pulling out a small weapon from his belt. Liara nodded and stepped closer to him, her mind racing. She had no idea what kind of danger they were facing, but she knew it wasn't something they could ignore. They crept forward, moving carefully through the broken city. Every corner they turned, every step they took, seemed to bring them closer to the source of the noise. Liara's heart pounded in her chest. It was impossible to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, they reached the source, a small, abandoned building half collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. The entrance was dark, and there was a heavy silence hanging in the air. Jake signaled to Liara to stay behind him as he moved cautiously toward the door. As he reached for the handle, the door creaked open with a loud groan. The two of them froze, eyes darting to the shadows inside. It was then that they saw it, two glowing eyes peering out from the darkness. "Who's there?" Jake called, his voice steady despite the tension that coiled in the air. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice, soft but clear, responded. "You're not alone, human." Liara's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped into the dim light. It was an alien, tall and slender, with pale skin that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Her eyes were a vibrant green, sharp and intelligent, but there was something else, something familiar. The alien woman studied them both carefully, her gaze lingering on Liara. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice calm but filled with an eerie knowing. "I knew you would come." Liara's mind raced. "Who are you? How do you know who I am?" she demanded. The alien woman smiled softly. "I know more about you than you realize," she replied. "You are the last of your kind, Liara, the last of the survivors." Liara's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know that name?" The alien woman's expression softened, and she stepped forward, her eyes filled with compassion. "I knew your people long ago. I was once one of them." Jake took a step forward, his protective instincts flaring. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice firm. The alien woman held up her hands in a peaceful gesture. "I mean you no harm. I came to help." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked past Jake and Liara. "But there are others who will not be so kind." Liara's mind was spinning. "What do you mean? Who else is out here?" The alien woman's expression darkened. "There are remnants of your people still scattered across this planet, but they are not the ones who betrayed you. There are others, those who seek to use what is left of your civilization for their own gain." "Why didn't you stop them?" Liara asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Why didn't you save my people?" The alien woman's face tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as if she were lost in thought. "I tried, but I was too late. And now we must stop them before they destroy what little remains." Jake's grip tightened around his weapon. "Then let's do it." The alien woman nodded, her expression resolute. "You're not alone, Lara. I will help you." Lara looked at Jake, her eyes filled with a new determination. She had been alone for so long, but now, with this stranger offering help, she finally had a chance to fight back. The past was full of pain, but her future was still in her hands. "We will make them pay for what they've done," Lara said, her voice firm with resolve. And so, with new allies and new hope, Lara and Jake prepared for the next chapter of their journey, a journey that would take them to the heart of the mystery, where they would confront the remnants of an ancient war that still threatened to destroy everything they had fought for. The air was thick with tension as Lara and Jake, along with their new ally, moved deeper into the heart of the ruined city. The buildings around them were skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving civilization. Now they served as silent witnesses to the horrors that had taken place here. As they ventured further, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hollow streets, sending a chill down Lara's spine. The alien woman, who had introduced herself as Kira, led the way. Her eyes darted around cautiously, as if she could sense something the others couldn't. Lara had no doubt that Kira's experience in this broken world was invaluable. After all, she was the only one who had managed to survive the fall of Lara's people and still remained determined to fight. "What do you think they're planning?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low as they moved. He was always looking ahead, never turning his back on danger. Kira glanced over her shoulder, her expression grim. "They've been gathering their forces. The ones responsible for your people's downfall aren't just after power. They're after control. They want to use what remains of your technology to dominate the galaxy." Lara's heart clenched at the thought. Her people had been brilliant, peaceful, until the betrayal. It still stung to think about it, the way they had been wiped out in such a cold, calculated manner. But now, with Jake by her side and Kira's knowledge, Lara had one thing the others didn't: hope. They reached an abandoned building at the edge of the city. Kira motioned for them to stop. "This is where the last of them are hiding. We need to be careful. They're well-armed and highly dangerous." Jake surveyed the building, eyes scanning every entrance. "Let's take them down, then." Kira nodded, and the three of them carefully made their way inside. The building was dark and empty, the air thick with dust. Every step they took seemed to echo in the quiet, making the silence feel heavier. But it was the kind of silence that filled Lara with unease. It was too quiet. It was a warning. They reached the center of the building and paused. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Lara's pulse quickened. She felt the familiar sensation of being hunted, but this time she wasn't alone. She had a plan. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "I knew you would come. It was just a matter of time." Lara's eyes darted to the source of the voice. Standing before them was a tall figure, dressed in dark, angular armor. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling confidence as he stepped forward, his movements calculated, precise. Kira tensed. "Doran," she muttered under her breath. "Doran." Lara repeated, her voice steady despite the shock that ran through her. "You were one of us. How could you?" Doran's smile was cold, his eyes filled with malice. "I was never one of you. I was always the one with the vision. You and your people were weak, too focused on peace, too blind to see what was truly needed." He turned his gaze to Jake. "And you, human. You don't even belong here. But your presence has been interesting." Jake's hand hovered near his weapon, but he didn't draw it just yet. "We didn't come here for a speech. We came to end this." Doran laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. "End this? You think you can stop what has already been set in motion?" Before Lara could respond, Doran raised his hand. The walls seemed to tremble as figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. They were armed, their eyes filled with the same cold determination as Doran's. Kira stepped forward, her voice steady. "You're outnumbered, Doran. You've underestimated us." Liara felt a surge of courage at Kira's words. She wasn't going to let Doran's betrayal define her. Not anymore. "We may be outnumbered," Liara said, stepping up beside Kira, "but we have something you don't. Unity. And we're not backing down." Doran's smile faltered for just a moment. "You think you can win. You're nothing." But just as the words left his lips, Jake made his move. With lightning speed, he lunged toward Doran, knocking him off balance. The two of them struggled, exchanging blows with surprising speed. Doran was strong, but Jake was faster, more determined. It was a battle of willpower, and in that moment, Jake's was unwavering. Liara and Kira sprang into action, taking on the remaining enemies. They fought with precision, each movement calculated, each strike aimed at disabling their opponents. Liara felt her confidence grow with every successful move. This was it. This was the moment where she would reclaim her future. As the last of the enemies fell, the building fell silent once more. The battle was over. Doran lay unconscious on the floor, his once confident demeanor shattered. Kira walked over to him, her eyes filled with disdain. "He was always a fool." Liara's breath came in quick gasps, but she couldn't help but smile. "We did it." Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it. We did it together." Kira nodded, her expression softening for the first time. "You're stronger than I thought, Liara. You've already begun to rebuild. And together, you will restore what was lost." Liara looked around at the ruins once more, but this time, she didn't see destruction. She saw a future built on the strength of her people, her allies, and the human who had stood by her side. And for the first time in a long time, Liara felt hope. The journey wasn't over, but it had taken a new direction, one filled with promise. The final stand had been fought, but the real work was only just beginning.